A billionaire fired his loyal secretary after 30 years of perfect service. When he announced the reason why at the company meeting, everyone was left absolutely shocked. What this CEO revealed about his connection to the woman who'd worked beside him for 3 decades changed everything anyone thought they knew about loyalty, family, and the secrets people keep to protect the ones they love. This is Edward Chen's story, and the truth about Patricia Williams that no one saw coming. A story about a 16-year-old girl who made an impossible choice in 1973, a successful businessman who discovered his entire life was built on a lie, and 30 years of working side by side while hiding the most important truth of all. Before we start the story, leave a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing our Deep Stories community growing all around the world. And at the end of this story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Let us know what you think. If you believe that family comes in unexpected forms, that some secrets are kept out of love, not shame, and that loyalty deserves recognition even when the truth is complicated, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is Edward Chen's journey, a story about a billionaire who fired his loyal secretary after 30 years, and the reason why that left everyone shocked. A story that begins not in a corporate boardroom, but in a small town in Ohio in 1973, with a terrified 16-year-old girl who had just discovered she was pregnant and had no idea how her life was about to change forever. Let's begin. Patricia Williams was 16 years old in the spring of 1973 when she realized she'd missed her period for the second month in a row. She sat in the bathroom of her parents' modest 2-bedroom house in Marion, Ohio, staring at the calendar she'd pulled from her purse, counting days over and over, hoping she'd made a mistake in her math. But there was no mistake. She was 8 weeks late. And she knew with a sinking certainty that made her feel physically sick exactly what that meant. She was pregnant, 16 years old, a junior in high school, with dreams of going to college and becoming a teacher, and she was pregnant. The father was Danny Morrison, a senior at her high school who she'd been dating for 6 months. They'd been in love, or what 16-year-olds think is love, that all-consuming intensity that makes everything feel dramatic and permanent. Danny was the quarterback of the football team, popular and handsome, and Patricia had felt lucky that he'd chosen her out of all the girls who wanted to date him. They'd talked about the future, about going to college together even though Danny had scholarship offers from schools all over the country. They'd made plans and promises the way teenagers do, believing their feelings would last forever because they couldn't imagine a world where they didn't. They'd been careful most of the time, or as careful as 2 teenagers with limited sex education and no real access to reliable birth control could be. But there had been one night in March, after a party at someone's house whose parents were out of town, when they'd gotten caught up in the moment and hadn't been careful at all. One night that was going to change both their lives forever, though in ways that Patricia couldn't have imagined sitting in that bathroom 2 months later, trying not to cry, trying to figure out how to tell her parents news that would devastate them. Patricia's parents, William and Dorothy Williams, were good people, hard-working and religious, pillars of their small community. William worked at the local manufacturing plant, making car parts, the same job he'd had for 20 years, steady and reliable if not particularly well paid. He worked the day shift, 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., came home tired and sweaty, ate dinner, read the newspaper, and went to bed early. He was a quiet man, not given to displays of emotion, but Patricia had always known he loved her in his own reserved way. He called her his little scholar, proud of her good grades and her plans to be the first person in their family to go to college. Dorothy was a homemaker who volunteered at their church and kept the most immaculate house in the neighborhood. She took pride in her home, in the way her floors shined and her windows sparkled, in the perfectly ironed clothes she sent her husband and daughter out into the world wearing. She was active in the church ladies, auxiliary, organized bake sales and charity drives, hosted Bible study in their living room every Wednesday evening. She had high standards and clear expectations for how people should behave, especially young women. She'd taught Patricia about modesty and propriety, about protecting your reputation, about the importance of remaining pure until marriage. They'd raised Patricia with clear values, strict rules, and high expectations. She was their only child, born after Dorothy had suffered 3 miscarriages and had been told she'd probably never carry a pregnancy to term. Patricia's birth had been a miracle, a gift from God, and her parents had devoted themselves to raising her right, giving her opportunities they'd never had, preparing her for a future that would be better than their own modest circumstances. She was supposed to be the success story of the Williams family, the girl who went to college, got a good job, married a nice boy from a good family, and built a comfortable middle-class life. She was not supposed to get pregnant at 16. For 2 weeks, Patricia kept the secret, going to school every day, smiling and pretending everything was normal while inside she was falling apart. She'd sit in her classes, the teacher's voice washing over her while she tried to calculate how far along she was, when the baby would be born, what she was going to do. She'd researched in the school library during study hall, pulling medical books from the shelves when the librarian wasn't looking, reading about pregnancy and fetal development and childbirth with a mixture of terror and strange fascination. There was a baby growing inside her. A whole human being with its own heartbeat and fingerprints was developing in her body, getting bigger every day, completely dependent on her for everything it needed. The responsibility was overwhelming in ways she couldn't fully process. She noticed changes in her body that frightened her. Her breasts were tender and swollen. She felt nauseous every morning, though she managed to hide it by saying she wasn't hungry for breakfast. She was exhausted all the time, could barely keep her eyes open during afternoon classes, came home and napped when she was supposed to be doing homework. Her clothes were starting to feel tighter around her waist, though the change was subtle enough that no one else had noticed yet. But Patricia knew it was only a matter of time before the pregnancy became visible, before people started asking questions she couldn't answer. She knew she had to tell Danny first, before her parents and before anyone else. They were in this together, right? He'd said he loved her. He'd talked about their future, about how they'd get married someday after college, about the life they'd build together. Surely he'd stand by her now when she needed him most. Surely he'd be scared too, but they'd figure it out together, make a plan, face this challenge as a team. That's what people who loved each other did, wasn't it? So one afternoon in late May, Patricia asked Danny to drive her to Riverside Park, the place where they'd had their first kiss back in November, where they'd spent so many afternoons sitting on the bench overlooking the small pond, talking about their dreams and making plans for their future. She told him she needed to talk to him about something important, something serious that couldn't wait. Danny had seemed nervous during the drive, probably sensing from her tone that something was wrong, but he'd agreed without asking questions. They sat on their usual bench, the spring afternoon warm and beautiful, birds singing, other people scattered around the park enjoying the nice weather. Everything normal and peaceful on the surface, while Patricia's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She'd rehearsed what she was going to say 100 times, trying to find words that would make this news less devastating, less frightening, less of a disaster. But there were no such words, so she'd just said it straight out, her voice shaking, tears already forming in her eyes. "Danny, I'm pregnant. I'm about 10 weeks along. The baby will be born in November." The silence that followed felt endless. Danny had gone completely still beside her, his face draining of color, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Patricia watched him process the information, watched shock turn to disbelief, turn to something that looked like panic. Then Danny had stood up so fast he nearly knocked Patricia off the bench, his voice coming out too loud, attracting attention from other people in the park. "You're what?" Danny had practically shouted. "How did this happen? Were you not being careful? Were you trying to trap me? Is this even my baby?" The accusations hit Patricia like physical blows, each one more painful than the last. "This can't be happening," Danny continued, his voice rising even higher. "I'm going to Ohio State in 3 months. I have a football scholarship. I'm going to play college ball, maybe even go pro someday. I can't have a baby. I can't be a father. I'm 17 years old." Patricia had tried to reach for his hand, tried to calm him down, tried to tell him they could figure this out together. But Danny had pulled away from her like she was something toxic, something dangerous that might contaminate him. "No," he'd said, backing away from the bench. "No, Patricia, you need to figure this out on your own. This is your problem. Get rid of it. Go to a clinic or something. My dad can give you money if you need it, but don't tell anyone it's mine. Don't tell anyone we ever slept together. I can't be associated with this. Do you understand? I have a future. I have plans. I'm not letting you ruin everything I've worked for." And then he'd left, just walked away, got in his car that his parents had bought him for his 17th birthday, and drove off, leaving Patricia sitting alone on that bench, crying so hard she could barely breathe. A woman walking her dog had stopped to ask if Patricia was okay, if she needed help, but Patricia had just shaken her head and run, stumbling through the park with tears streaming down her face, not even sure where she was going, just knowing she needed to get away from that place where the boy who'd said he loved her had just abandoned her in the cruelest way possible. Patricia walked for hours that afternoon, through neighborhoods she barely recognized, trying to process what had just happened. Danny didn't want the baby. Danny didn't want her. Everything he'd said about loving her, about their future together, had been lies or had evaporated the moment things got difficult. She'd been naive to expect anything different, she realized. They were teenagers. Danny had his whole life ahead of him, opportunities and possibilities he wasn't going to sacrifice for a girl he'd gotten pregnant. She understood that intellectually, even as her heart was breaking, even as she felt more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. When Patricia finally made it home that evening, hours late, her mother had been frantic with worry. Where had she been? Why hadn't she called? Why was she crying? Patricia had made up some story about staying after school for a project and losing track of time, had claimed she was crying because she'd done poorly on a test. Dorothy had seemed to accept the explanation, though she'd looked at Patricia with concern, asking if everything was really okay. Patricia had nodded, forced a smile, said she was just tired and stressed about finals. Then she'd gone to her room, closed the door, and cried until she had no tears left. 2 more weeks passed before Patricia found the courage to tell her parents. 2 weeks of carrying this devastating secret alone, of going through the motions of being a normal teenager while feeling like her entire world was crumbling. She thought about running away, just leaving Marion and starting over somewhere else where no one knew her. She thought about the clinic Danny had mentioned, wondered if she could somehow get the money for an abortion without anyone knowing. She thought about keeping the baby, about somehow making it work even though she had no idea how a 16-year-old with no job and no support could raise a child. But ultimately, Patricia knew she had to tell her parents. She couldn't hide the pregnancy forever. She couldn't run away with no money and nowhere to go. She couldn't get an abortion without parental permission, and even if she could, something in her resisted the idea of ending the pregnancy. This baby, however unplanned and unwanted and inconvenient, was still a life, still a person who deserved a chance to exist. Patricia might only be 16, but she already felt a connection to the tiny being growing inside her, a protective instinct she couldn't ignore. So on a Sunday evening in early June, after they'd finished dinner and cleaned up the kitchen, Patricia asked her parents if she could talk to them about something important. They'd settled in the living room, William in his recliner with the newspaper, Dorothy on the sofa with her knitting. Everything was normal and comfortable and safe, and Patricia was about to destroy all of that with 5 words that would change their lives forever. "Mom, Dad," Patricia had said, her voice shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. "I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute and terrible, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the sound of Dorothy's knitting needles falling to the floor. Patricia watched her father's face go through a series of expressions that she would remember for the rest of her life. Shock, his eyes widening, his mouth falling open. Disbelief, shaking his head slowly as if he could deny the reality of what he'd just heard. Understanding. The horrible moment when he realized this wasn't a joke or a mistake, but actual truth. And then anger, his face flushing red, the newspaper crumpling in his hands as he gripped it tighter. "No," Dorothy had whispered, her hands flying to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. "No, Patricia, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you're joking or mistaken or this is some kind of misunderstanding. Please." But the desperation in her mother's voice just made Patricia feel worse, made the guilt and shame even more overwhelming. "I'm sorry," Patricia had said, crying now too. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I know I disappointed you. I know I've ruined everything. I'm so sorry." William had exploded out of his chair, the newspaper falling to the floor. Forgotten. "How could you do this?" he'd shouted, his voice louder than Patricia had ever heard it, making her flinch back against the wall. "How could you be so stupid, so careless, so willing to throw away your entire future? Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand what this means?" His words came out like blows, each one hitting Patricia and making her feel smaller, more ashamed, more worthless. "Who's the father?" William had demanded. "Is it that Morrison boy you've been dating? Does he know?" Patricia had nodded miserably. "I told him. He said it's my problem. He doesn't want anything to do with the baby or me. He said I should get rid of it and not tell anyone it's his." That information had somehow made William even angrier. "That coward," he'd spat. "That worthless, spineless coward. But you know what? He's being smart. He's protecting his future, which is more than I can say for you." Dorothy had been crying continuously, rocking back and forth on the sofa, her hands pressed to her face. "What will people say?" she'd kept asking. "What will the church think? What will our neighbors think? How can we show our faces in this town with an unwed pregnant teenage daughter? We'll be a scandal. We'll be gossip fodder. People will look at us and whisper and judge and think we failed as parents." And that, Patricia realized, was what hurt her mother most. Not Patricia's situation, not the baby, but what other people would think of the Williams family. The conversation had gone on for hours, painful and circular and devastating. William angry and disappointed, his voice raised more than Patricia had ever heard in her 16 years of life. Dorothy crying and asking how this could have happened, alternating between hugging Patricia and pushing her away as if she couldn't decide whether her daughter needed comfort or punishment. Patricia trying to apologize, trying to explain, trying to make them understand that she knew she'd made a mistake, but that she was scared and needed their help, not their anger. Eventually, exhausted and hoarse from shouting and crying, William had told Patricia to go to her room while he and Dorothy discussed what to do. Patricia had fled, grateful to escape the living room that had become a courtroom where she'd been tried and found guilty. She'd lain on her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her parents, voices drifting up through the floorboards, unable to make out words but hearing the tone, the anger and disappointment and grief. For 3 days after that terrible Sunday evening, Patricia's parents barely spoke to her beyond what was absolutely necessary. They were processing, grieving for the future they'd envisioned for their daughter, trying to figure out what to do about a situation that had no good solutions. Dorothy cried constantly, her eyes always red, makeup smeared from tears she couldn't stop. William became cold and distant, unable to look at his daughter without visible disappointment etched on his face. And Patricia, caught in the middle of this nightmare, felt more alone than she'd ever imagined possible. trapped in a house where the people who were supposed to love her most could barely stand to be in the same room with her. It was Dorothy who finally broke the terrible silence on Wednesday evening. She'd called Patricia down to the kitchen where she and William were sitting at the table, a pot of coffee between them, their faces drawn and tired. "Sit down, Patricia," Dorothy had said, her voice flat and exhausted. "Your father and I have made a decision about what to do." Patricia had sat, her heart pounding, terrified of what they were going to say. Were they kicking her out? Forcing her to marry Danny somehow? Making her get an abortion? "There's a home for unwed mothers in Columbus," Dorothy had explained, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she needed the warmth. "It's called St. Mary's. It's run by Catholic nuns. Pregnant girls go there to have their babies away from judgmental eyes. You'll live there through your pregnancy, receive medical care, give birth at a hospital they're affiliated with, and then give the baby up for adoption. It's discreet. It's respectable as these things can be, and it will allow you to have this baby without destroying your future or permanently damaging our family's reputation in this town." Patricia had felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Give the baby up for adoption. She was supposed to carry this child for 9 months and then just hand it over to strangers. "I don't want to give the baby up," Patricia had said, her voice small. "Can't I keep it? Can't we figure out a way to make it work? I could get a job after school, or—" But William had cut her off harshly. "No, absolutely not. You are not keeping this baby, Patricia. You are 16 years old. You have no money, no job, no way to support yourself, much less a child. And your mother and I are not raising your baby for you. We're not going to sacrifice our lives to clean up your mess. The plan is this," Dorothy had continued, her voice still that same flat, exhausted tone. "You'll finish the school year here. Then in late June, you'll go to Columbus, supposedly to spend the summer with my sister Helen helping with her children. In reality, you'll be at St. Mary's. You'll stay there through your pregnancy. You'll have the baby in November. You'll give it up for adoption. And you'll return home in December, in time to finish your senior year. Everyone in Marion will think you spent the summer and fall with family, that you had mono or some other illness that required a long recovery. No one needs to know about the pregnancy. No one needs to know about the baby. We'll put this behind us and move forward like it never happened." Patricia had wanted to argue, wanted to fight for some other solution, but she could see from her parents' faces that their minds were made up. This was happening whether she agreed to it or not. She had no power here, no choices, no control over her own body or her own future. She was 16 years old, financially dependent on parents who had decided what was best for everyone, and that decision included giving away the baby she was carrying. "Do you understand, Patricia?" William had asked, his voice stern. "This is the plan. You'll do exactly as we say. You'll go to St. Mary's. You'll have the baby. You'll give it up for adoption. And then you'll come home and finish school and go to college and build the life you were supposed to have before you threw it all away with your carelessness. Do you understand?" Patricia had nodded, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Good," William had said. "Now go to your room. Your mother and I need to make arrangements." The final weeks of Patricia's junior year were agony. She went to school every day, watching her classmates make plans for summer, talking about parties and vacations and all the normal things teenagers do, while Patricia carried her secret and counted down the days until she'd have to leave for Columbus. She saw Danny in the hallways, watched him laugh with his friends and flirt with other girls as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't gotten her pregnant and then abandoned her. He never looked at her, never acknowledged her existence, had apparently decided that if he pretended hard enough, he could make the whole situation disappear. Patricia's body continued to change. By the end of May, she could no longer button her jeans comfortably and had to start wearing loose dresses that hid her slowly expanding belly. She felt the baby move for the first time during finals week, a flutter so subtle she wasn't sure at first if she'd imagined it. But as the days passed, the movements became more distinct, tiny kicks and rolls that reminded Patricia constantly that there was a person growing inside her, a baby who would be born in a few months and then taken away from her forever. On June 15, 1973, the day after school let out for summer, Dorothy drove Patricia to Columbus. The drive was silent and tense, neither of them knowing what to say to each other, the enormity of what was happening sitting between them like a physical presence. They arrived at St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers in the late afternoon, a large old Victorian house on the outskirts of Columbus that had been converted into a facility for housing pregnant teenagers. The house was painted white with blue trim, surrounded by a high fence that created a sense of privacy, but also felt like a prison to Patricia as they drove through the gates. Sister Margaret, the nun who ran St. Mary's, met them at the front door. She was a stern woman in her 60s, wearing the traditional black and white habit of her order, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through Patricia's brave facade to the terrified 16-year-old underneath. "You must be Patricia Williams," Sister Margaret had said, her voice brisk and businesslike. "And you're Dorothy Williams, her mother. Come in, please. We have paperwork to complete and rules to discuss." The inside of St. Mary's was clean and institutional, with religious imagery on the walls, crucifixes and paintings of Mary and statues of various saints positioned throughout the house. Sister Margaret led them to her office, a small room with a desk, filing cabinets, and uncomfortable wooden chairs. She produced a thick stack of paperwork that Dorothy had to sign, legal documents that granted St. Mary's temporary custody of Patricia, medical release forms, agreements about what would happen after the baby was born. The adoption would be handled through Catholic charities. Sister Margaret explained. The baby would be placed with a good Catholic family who'd been carefully screened. Patricia would never know who adopted the baby, and they would never know who she was. It was better that way, a clean break that would allow everyone to move forward. After the paperwork was completed, Sister Margaret outlined the rules that governed life at St. Mary's. The girls would wake at 6 a.m. every morning for prayers and breakfast. They would complete assigned chores throughout the day, keeping the house clean and helping to prepare meals. They would attend educational sessions about childcare, adoption, and preparing for the future. Though Sister Margaret's tone when she described these sessions suggested they were more about instilling shame and teaching girls not to repeat their mistakes than about actual education. The girls were allowed to receive mail and limited phone calls from immediate family, but no visitors except parents and only with advance permission. They were absolutely not allowed to have any contact with the fathers of their babies or with friends from home who might spread gossip. "You're here because you made a mistake," Sister Margaret had said, looking directly at Patricia with those piercing blue eyes. "You engaged in sinful behavior, and now you must face the consequences. We provide you with shelter and medical care out of Christian charity, but make no mistake, this is not a vacation or a pleasant summer camp. You will work. You will pray. You will think seriously about the choices that brought you here. And when you leave, you will be a wiser, more careful young woman who understands the importance of purity and restraint." After the orientation, Dorothy had said a brief, awkward goodbye to Patricia, hugging her stiffly and reminding her to write home regularly. Then she'd left, driving away in the family car, leaving Patricia alone in this strange place with women she didn't know and a future that felt increasingly terrifying. Sister Margaret had shown Patricia to her room, a small dormitory-style space with 4 narrow beds, 4 small dressers, and 1 window that looked out onto the fenced backyard. 3 of the beds were already occupied by other girls in various stages of pregnancy. "This is Linda, Carol, and Angela," Sister Margaret had said, gesturing to Patricia's new roommates. "They'll help you learn our routines. Dinner is in 30 minutes. I expect you downstairs, dressed appropriately, ready to contribute." Then she'd left, closing the door behind her, and Patricia had been alone with 3 other pregnant teenagers who looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. Linda was 14 years old, tiny and fragile-looking, 7 months pregnant with a belly that seemed impossibly large on her small frame. She barely spoke, just nodded at Patricia and went back to reading a worn paperback novel on her bed. Carol was 17, defiant and angry, 6 months pregnant and openly hostile toward the nuns and the entire situation. She'd rolled her eyes at Patricia and muttered something about another scared little girl joining their happy family. And Angela was 19, 5 months pregnant, with a sadness in her eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently, maybe frequently. Angela was the one who'd approached Patricia after Sister Margaret left, offering a tentative smile. "I know it's overwhelming," she'd said quietly. "I've been here 2 months, and it's still hard, but you get used to the routine. And the other girls, we help each other. It's not as bad as it seems at first. I promise." Patricia had wanted to believe her, but looking around the small room with its institutional beds and bare walls, thinking about the months she'd have to spend here, the baby she'd have to give up, the life that waited for her after this was all over. Patricia had felt a despair so deep it was almost physical. That first dinner at St. Mary's was awkward and painful. 12 girls sat around a long table in the dining room, ranging in age from 14 to 19, all in various stages of pregnancy, all wearing the same expression of fear and shame and resignation. Sister Margaret and 2 other nuns sat at the head of the table, saying grace before the meal and then eating in silence while they watched the girls with stern disapproval. The food was plain and institutional, nothing like the meals Patricia's mother cooked. But Patricia forced herself to eat knowing the baby needed nutrition even if she had no appetite. After dinner, the girls were required to attend evening prayers in the small chapel St. Mary's maintained in what had once been the house's formal dining room. They knelt on hard wooden kneelers, reciting prayers Patricia had learned in Sunday school, but that now felt like accusations rather than comfort. "Hail Mary, full of grace, blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb." The irony wasn't lost on Patricia or any of the other girls. Mary had been blessed for her pregnancy. They were being punished for theirs. The days at St. Mary's settled into a grinding routine that was monotonous and exhausting in equal measure. Wake at 6 for prayers. Breakfast at 6:30. Chores from 7 to noon, cleaning bathrooms and mopping floors and doing laundry and helping to prepare meals. Lunch at noon, educational sessions in the afternoon, nuns lecturing about the importance of moral purity and the devastating consequences of sexual sin. More chores in the late afternoon. Dinner at 6. Evening prayers at 7. Free time until 9. Though there was little to do during that free time except read donated books that had been carefully screened to ensure they contained no inappropriate content, or sit and talk with the other girls about the futures they'd lost and the babies they'd soon give away. Lights out at 9:30, strictly enforced. The routine was designed to keep the girls busy, to prevent them from dwelling too much on their situations, but it had the opposite effect on Patricia. Every moment of every day, she was acutely aware of where she was and why. Every time she scrubbed a floor or folded laundry or listened to Sister Margaret lecture about sin and redemption, Patricia felt the baby moving inside her and thought about the fact that in a few months, she'd give birth and never see her child again. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, made worse by the isolation from everyone and everything she'd known before. Patricia's roommates became her closest companions during those long summer months, united by shared experience and the unique pain of being pregnant teenagers forced to give up their babies. Linda, the 14-year-old, had gotten pregnant as a result of her stepfather's abuse, a horrific situation that had only ended when Linda's mother had finally believed her daughter and kicked the stepfather out. But the damage was done. The pregnancy too far along to terminate, even if Linda's family could have afforded it or been willing to consider that option. Linda was so traumatized that she barely spoke, rarely cried, just existed in a state of numb shock that broke Patricia's heart every time she looked at her. Carol was defiant where Linda was withdrawn, angry at everyone and everything. She'd gotten pregnant by her high school boyfriend, who'd promised to marry her and then disappeared the moment he found out about the baby. Carol's parents were forcing her to give the baby up for adoption, but Carol was determined to keep it, though she had no concrete plan for how to manage being a single teenage mother with no money and no support. She spent much of her time arguing with Sister Margaret about her rights, about whether she could really be forced to sign adoption papers, about what would happen if she simply refused to cooperate. The nuns were unmoved by Carol's protests. She was 17, still a minor, under her parents' authority. She would give the baby up whether she agreed to it or not. Angela, the 19-year-old, was engaged to her baby's father, a young man named Michael who desperately wanted to marry her immediately and raise the baby together. But Angela's parents, wealthy and concerned about their social reputation, had refused to allow the marriage until after the baby was gone. They wanted the pregnancy erased, the evidence of premarital sex eliminated, so Angela could get married without the scandal of an obvious pregnancy at her wedding. Angela spent hours crying, writing letters to Michael that the nuns screened before they were mailed, dreaming about the life she'd have with him once this nightmare was over, trying not to think about the baby she'd have to give away first. The four roommates would lie awake late at night after lights out, whispering to each other in the darkness, sharing fears and hopes and grief. Linda talking in fragments about the abuse she'd suffered, the betrayal of her mother not believing her at first, the fear of what would happen after the baby was born and she had to return home. Carol making plans for escape, for somehow keeping her baby despite everyone telling her it was impossible. Her determination both admirable and heartbreaking, because everyone except Carol could see how unlikely her plans were to succeed. Angela crying softly into her pillow, grieving for the baby she was carrying but would never raise. The child who would be given to strangers while Angela married Michael and pretended none of this had ever happened. And Patricia, talking about her own situation, about Danny who'd abandoned her, about her parents, disappointment and shame, about the future she was supposed to have after this was all over, college and teaching career and normal life, as if giving up a baby was something you could just move past without it fundamentally changing who you were. Patricia didn't believe it was possible to move on so completely, but she didn't say that to her parents in the brief phone calls home. She just told them she was fine, that everything at St. Mary's was fine, that she was following the rules and preparing for what came next. As Patricia's pregnancy progressed through the summer and into fall, her body changed in ways that were both fascinating and frightening. Her belly grew larger and rounder, her skin stretching until she had red marks that the nurses told her would eventually fade to silver scars she'd carry for the rest of her life. Her breasts swelled, preparing to feed a baby she wouldn't keep. Her ankles swelled in the heat of August day, making it painful to stand for long periods during kitchen duty. She felt the baby move constantly, especially at night. Tiny kicks and rolls that kept her awake and made her wonder what this person would be like, who they'd become, whether they'd be happy with whatever family adopted them. The medical care at St. Mary's was basic but adequate. A doctor came once a month to check on all the pregnant girls, examining them with clinical efficiency but little warmth or compassion. The girls were weighed and measured, their blood pressure checked, their bellies palpated to assess the baby's position and growth. Patricia's checkups were always the same. Everything was progressing normally. The baby was developing well. She was healthy despite the stress and sadness. The baby would likely be born right around the due date in mid-November. In October, as Patricia entered her 8th month of pregnancy, St. Mary's started preparing the girls who were due soon for what would happen when labor began. They attended classes about the stages of labor, what contractions would feel like, what to expect at the hospital. But notably absent from these classes was any discussion of what would happen after the baby was born, how the separation would work, what the girls would experience emotionally. That was considered unnecessary information, or perhaps too painful to address directly. The focus was on getting through the birth, signing the paperwork, and moving forward as quickly as possible. Patricia went into labor on a cold November night, 3 days before her 17th birthday. It started around midnight with cramping pains in her lower back that gradually moved to her belly, tightening and releasing in waves that grew stronger and closer together as the hours passed. Patricia had woken her roommates, whispered that she thought it was happening, and Linda had immediately gone to get Sister Margaret. The nun had come to their room, checked Patricia's condition with brisk efficiency, and confirmed she was in labor. An ambulance was called to transport Patricia to St. Anne's Hospital, where St. Mary's girls gave birth under arrangements the nuns had made with the Catholic hospital. The ambulance ride was terrifying. Patricia lay on a gurney in the back, alone except for a bored EMT who seemed annoyed to be dealing with yet another unwed mother from St. Mary's in the middle of the night. He didn't speak to her, didn't offer comfort or encouragement, just monitored her vital signs with clinical detachment, while Patricia tried to breathe through contractions that were getting stronger and more painful by the minute. The sirens were off since this wasn't a medical emergency, just a routine transport, and the dark streets of Columbus rolled by outside the ambulance windows, while Patricia wondered if she was going to die, if childbirth was supposed to hurt this much, if anyone would care if something went wrong. At the hospital, things were even worse. Patricia was taken to a labor and delivery ward that felt cold and impersonal, all harsh fluorescent lights and linoleum floors and medical equipment that looked frightening. She was given a hospital gown that barely closed, examined by a nurse who handled her roughly, told to lie in bed and wait for the doctor while contractions continued to build in intensity. There was no one to hold her hand, no one to tell her she was doing well, no one to offer comfort or support. Her mother wasn't there. Patricia had asked if Dorothy could be present for the birth, but her parents had refused, said it would be too hard, too painful, too much of a reminder of their daughter's shame. Labor lasted 18 hours, 18 hours of pain that Patricia hadn't known existed, that built and built until she was crying and screaming, begging for relief that came only in brief moments between contractions. Nurses rotated in and out, checking her progress with clinical efficiency, sometimes offering encouraging words, but more often treating her with the cold disapproval that seemed to be the standard response to unwed mothers in 1973. The doctor didn't appear until Patricia was fully dilated and ready to push, sweeping into the delivery room like he was doing her a favor by showing up at all. The pushing stage lasted for over an hour. Patricia, exhausted and in agony, following instructions shouted by the doctor and nurses, bearing down with every ounce of strength she had left. And then finally, just after dawn on November 20th, after 18 hours of labor and more pain than Patricia had thought possible, the baby was born. A boy, tiny and red and screaming, perfect and beautiful and alive. Patricia heard him before she saw him. That first cry so loud and strong it seemed impossible it could come from something so small. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, holding up the baby for Patricia to see for just a moment before passing him to a waiting nurse. "Appears healthy, good weight, strong cry. The adoptive family will be pleased." Then the baby was taken to a warming table across the room, cleaned and examined while Patricia strained to see him, to get another glimpse of the son she'd just brought into the world and would lose almost immediately. The nurse who'd cleaned the baby brought him to Patricia wrapped in a white hospital blanket. "You have 5 minutes?" she'd said, her tone suggesting this was a generous concession rather than a cruelty. The policy at St. Mary's is to allow birth mothers a brief time with the baby before placement in the nursery. It helps with closure. But keep in mind that prolonged contact makes the separation harder, so we limit it to 5 minutes. Patricia took her son in her arms, and the moment she looked at his face, she understood what love really was. This tiny person with dark hair matted to his head and Patricia's own brown eyes looking up at her with unfocused newborn sight, this was her child, her son, a whole person who'd grown inside her for 9 months, who she'd protected and nourished with her own body, who she'd given life to despite all the fear and pain and shame. He was perfect. He was beautiful. And in 5 minutes, he'd be taken away from her forever. Patricia memorized every detail of her son's face during those 5 precious minutes. The shape of his eyes and the curve of his ears. The way his tiny fingers curled around her thumb when she offered it. The little sounds he made, not quite cries, but not quite coos either. The noises newborns make when they're getting used to being in the world. She whispered to him, told him she loved him, told him she was sorry, told him she hoped he'd have a good life with whatever family adopted him. She told him she'd never forget him, that she'd think about him every day, that even though she couldn't keep him, he was hers and she was his, and that would never change no matter how much distance or time separated them. Then the 5 minutes were up. The nurse returned, held out her arms for the baby, and when Patricia hesitated, the nurse's expression hardened. "It's time, dear. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Patricia had kissed her son's forehead one last time, inhaled his newborn scent, and then handed him to the nurse. The nurse carried him away without another word, disappearing through a door that led to the nursery, and Patricia was left alone in the delivery room, her arms empty, her heart shattering into pieces she didn't think could ever be put back together. The next 3 days in the hospital were a blur of physical pain and emotional devastation. Patricia's body was recovering from childbirth, hormone crashing, milk coming in for a baby she'd never feed. The nurses bound her breasts tightly and gave her medication to suppress lactation, a process that was physically uncomfortable and emotionally agonizing. Her body had prepared to nourish her child, and now it had to be tricked into stopping those preparations because there was no baby to feed. A social worker from Catholic Charities came to Patricia's room on the 2nd day to have her sign the legal documents terminating her parental rights. The woman was kind enough in her manner, but firm about what needed to happen. Patricia signed paper after paper, legal documents written in language she barely understood, forms that made the adoption official and permanent and irrevocable. Once these papers were signed, the social worker explained, Patricia would have no legal right to know anything about her son or the family who adopted him. It was a closed adoption, standard practice in 1973, designed to protect everyone involved by ensuring complete separation between birth mother and adoptive family. "You're doing the right thing," the social worker had said, her tone earnest and encouraging. "You're giving your baby a chance at a good life with 2 parents who can provide for him in ways you can't at your age. The family who will adopt him has been carefully screened. They're financially stable, morally upright, committed to raising your son in a loving Christian home. He'll have every advantage, every opportunity. You should feel good about the choice you're making." But Patricia didn't feel good. She felt destroyed, hollowed out, empty in ways that went far beyond the physical absence of the pregnancy. She'd given birth to a son and then given him away, and now she was supposed to just move on with her life as if none of this had ever happened. She was supposed to go back to high school and finish her senior year and go to college and build a career and pretend there wasn't a child somewhere in the world who had her eyes and her blood and her genetic code, but who she'd never know. Patricia returned to St. Mary's to recover for another week before going home. She was quiet and withdrawn, barely speaking even to her roommates who tried to comfort her. Linda had given birth 2 days after Patricia, a little girl who was immediately adopted, and now both of them moved through the house like ghosts, physically present but emotionally absent. Carol hadn't gone into labor yet, still had 3 more weeks, but watching Patricia and Linda return from the hospital had changed something in her. The defiance was gone, replaced by resignation. She'd stopped talking about keeping her baby, stopped arguing with the nuns, had seemingly accepted that this was what was going to happen whether she fought it or not. Angela had given birth the week before Patricia, and she'd already left St. Mary's to return home and prepare for her wedding to Michael. She'd written Patricia a letter before she left, thanking her for the friendship, wishing her well, saying she hoped Patricia's life would be happy, even though Angela couldn't imagine how any of them were supposed to be happy after what they'd been through. Angela's letter had ended with a question Patricia couldn't answer. Do you think we'll ever stop thinking about them? Our babies? Or will we spend the rest of our lives wondering? When Patricia finally returned home to Marion in mid-December, it was to a life that was expected to simply resume as if nothing significant had happened. Her parents didn't talk about the pregnancy or the baby or the months she'd spent at St. Mary's. The story was that she'd been staying with Aunt Helen in Chicago, that she'd had a serious bout of mononucleosis that had required a long recovery period. Her father went back to being politely distant, uncomfortable with the whole situation but determined to pretend it had never occurred. Her mother cried less but also withdrew emotionally, as if afraid that talking about what had happened would somehow make it more real, more permanent, more impossible to move past. Patricia finished her senior year in a fog of grief and numbness that she hid behind a mask of normalcy. She went to classes and did her homework and got good grades and applied to colleges. She smiled and made small talk and went to prom with a boy from her English class who she felt nothing for but who was nice and safe and didn't ask uncomfortable questions. She graduated in June of 1974 with honors and a scholarship to Ohio State University. She moved to Columbus that fall to start college, and no one except her family and the nuns at St. Mary's knew that she'd given birth to a son the previous November and given him up for adoption. College was Patricia's escape from the constant reminders of what had happened. At Ohio State, no one knew her history. No one knew about Danny or the pregnancy or St. Mary's or the baby she'd given away. She could reinvent herself, be a normal college student focused on her future rather than haunted by her past. She threw herself into her studies, majoring in education with plans to become an elementary school teacher. She joined clubs and made friends and built a life that from the outside looked completely normal and healthy. But inside, Patricia carried a grief and a loss that colored everything, a shadow that never entirely lifted no matter how bright the surface of her life appeared. In her junior year, Patricia met Thomas Williams at a study group in the library. He was an engineering student, quiet and steady and kind, completely different from Danny or any of the boys Patricia had dated in high school. Thomas didn't sweep her off her feet or make her heart race. What he offered was something different and perhaps more valuable: stability, safety, the promise of a normal life with someone who was reliable and decent and unlikely to hurt her the way Danny had. They dated for 2 years, a relationship that developed slowly and carefully. Thomas was respectful, never pushing Patricia for more than she was ready to give, content to wait until they were married to have sex. Patricia appreciated that, needed that, couldn't imagine being intimate with someone without the security of marriage after what had happened with Danny. When Thomas proposed during their senior year, Patricia said yes without hesitation. Marriage meant building a new life, a legitimate life, a life where she could have children she'd be allowed to keep and raise. Patricia and Thomas were married in August of 1978, a small ceremony at the Methodist church Patricia's family attended, with a modest reception afterward at a local restaurant. They honeymooned for a weekend at a bed and breakfast in the countryside, then returned to Columbus to start their married life together. Thomas had gotten a job as an engineer at a manufacturing company. Patricia had been hired as a third-grade teacher at an elementary school. They rented a small apartment, bought second-hand furniture, built a life that was modest but comfortable and filled with the hope of better things to come. Patricia didn't tell Thomas about the baby she'd given up. She told herself it was because the past was the past, because what happened when she was 16 didn't matter anymore, because Thomas didn't need to know about a mistake she'd made before she'd even met him. But really, Patricia was ashamed. Ashamed of getting pregnant so young, ashamed of giving her baby away, ashamed of the whole situation and terrified that if Thomas knew the truth, he might see her differently, might think less of her, might wonder if she was the kind of woman he really wanted to be married to. So Patricia kept her secret and built her new life. She and Thomas had their first child, Sarah, in 1979. Patricia threw herself into motherhood with an intensity that surprised Thomas, as if she was trying to make up for something, though he didn't know what. She was devoted to Sarah, protective almost to the point of being smothering, unable to relax until she'd checked on her sleeping daughter multiple times each night. Thomas attributed it to first-time mother anxiety, had no way of knowing that Patricia was parenting Sarah with the ghost of another child always present, a son she'd held for 5 minutes and then never seen again. Michael was born in 1982 and Jennifer in 1985. Patricia loved her children fiercely, was the kind of mother who attended every school event, volunteered in every classroom, made elaborate birthday cakes and Halloween costumes and Christmas celebrations. From the outside, Patricia's life looked perfect. Devoted mother, stable marriage, nice home in a good neighborhood, career she enjoyed, but there was always a shadow over her happiness. The knowledge that somewhere out there she had another child, a firstborn she'd given away and would never know. Every year on November 20th, Patricia would spend the day thinking about her son, wondering what he was doing, what kind of person he'd become, whether he was happy. She'd look at Sarah and Michael and Jennifer and try to imagine what her first child might look like now, whether he'd inherited her features or his father's, whether he'd be good at sports or academics or art. She prayed for him, hoped he was happy, carried a guilt that never entirely faded even as years turned into decades and her son's birthday marked time passing in a life Patricia wasn't part of. Thomas died suddenly in 1995. A heart attack at age 45 that left Patricia widowed with 3 teenagers still living at home. The loss was devastating, not just because Patricia had lost her husband, but because Thomas had been her anchor, the stable presence that had allowed her to build a normal life after the trauma of her teenage pregnancy. Now that stability was gone, and Patricia had to figure out how to manage alone, she threw herself into work, picking up extra shifts as a substitute teacher to make ends meet, taking on secretarial jobs in the evenings and summers to supplement her income. Patricia discovered she was excellent at administrative work, organized and efficient and professional in ways that made her valuable to the companies she worked for. When one of those temporary secretarial positions turned into a full-time job offer with significantly better pay and benefits than teaching provided, Patricia made the difficult decision to leave education and become an executive secretary. The pay was better, the hours were more predictable, and frankly, Patricia needed the money and stability more than she needed the satisfaction of teaching. By 1995, Patricia's children were growing up and becoming independent. Sarah was in college, Michael was a high school senior, and Jennifer was a sophomore. Patricia was 52 years old, a widow, building a career in administrative work while trying not to think too much about the son she'd given up 42 years earlier. She'd registered with several adoption reunion registries over the years, hoping that maybe someday he'd search for her and they could connect. But decades passed with no contact, and Patricia gradually accepted that she'd probably never know what had happened to the baby she'd given birth to when she was barely more than a child herself. Then one day in late 1995, Patricia saw a job posting that caught her attention. Chen Global Industries, a rapidly growing technology company, was looking for an executive secretary for their CEO. The salary was significantly higher than what Patricia was currently making. The benefits were excellent. The company had a great reputation. Patricia was thinking about her financial future, about making sure she had adequate retirement savings, about providing for herself now that Thomas was gone, and her children would soon be on their own. This job would be a significant step up professionally and financially. She applied, interviewed, and was hired. Patricia started working at Chen Global Industries in early 1996, excited about the opportunity, grateful for the salary increase, ready to prove herself in this new position. She had no idea that Edward Chen, the CEO who'd personally made the decision to hire her, was her biological son. No idea that he'd been searching for his birth mother, had found her, and had engineered this entire situation to bring her into his life. As far as Patricia knew, Edward Chen was just her new boss, a demanding but fair CEO who expected excellence and recognized good work. Those first 6 months working for Edward were professionally fulfilling, but also strangely complicated in ways Patricia couldn't quite articulate. She was good at her job, better than good, and Edward clearly recognized her capabilities. He gave her increasing responsibility, trusted her with important tasks, consulted her on decisions that went beyond typical secretarial duties. They developed an excellent working relationship, professional and productive, but there was something else there too, something Patricia couldn't identify. Edward paid attention to her in ways that felt more personal than professional. He asked about her life, her family, her background, questions that seemed genuinely interested rather than just making polite conversation. He remembered details she mentioned casually, followed up on things she'd said weeks earlier, seemed to care about her well-being in ways that went beyond normal boss-employee dynamics. Patricia found herself liking him despite the power differential, appreciating his intelligence and work ethic, feeling strangely protective of him even though he was her boss and certainly didn't need protection from his secretary. It wasn't until October of 1996, 6 months after Patricia had started working at Chen Global, that Edward finally revealed the truth. He'd asked Patricia to stay late one evening to help him prepare for an important board presentation the next day. They'd worked until everyone else had left the building, reviewing slides and rehearsing talking points, the easy collaboration that had developed between them making the work go quickly. Then, as they were finishing up around 9 p.m., Edward had told Patricia there was something else he needed to discuss with her, something that had nothing to do with work, but that he couldn't keep secret any longer. Patricia had felt a flutter of anxiety, wondering if she was being fired, if, despite her excellent performance, something she'd done had displeased him. But what Edward told her was so far beyond anything she could have imagined that at first she thought she must have misheard him or misunderstood somehow. Edward explaining that his name hadn't always been Edward Chen, that he'd been adopted, that he'd learned the truth at 40 years old when his adoptive parents died. Edward showing her documents, an original birth certificate that listed Patricia Williams, age 16, as the mother. Edward saying the words that changed everything. "I'm your son. The baby you gave up for adoption. I've known who you were since before I hired you." The conversation that followed was one of the most emotionally intense experiences of Patricia's entire life, exceeded only by the day she'd given birth and been forced to give her son away. Edward's anger and hurt pouring out, all the questions he'd apparently been saving up for 6 months. Why had she given him up? Had she ever thought about him? Did she regret her decision? Had she tried to find him? And Patricia trying to explain through tears and shaking hands what it had been like to be 16 and pregnant in 1973, how limited her options had been, how her parents had forced the adoption, how she'd spent 40 years wondering about him and praying he was okay and hoping he'd forgive her someday for a choice that hadn't really felt like a choice at all. By the end of that conversation, both Patricia and Edward were emotionally exhausted, eyes red from crying, voices hoarse from talking. Patricia had offered to resign immediately, assuming Edward must hate her, must be disgusted by the mother who'd abandoned him, must want nothing to do with her now that he'd confronted her with his pain. But Edward had surprised her by asking if they could try to build a relationship, not just as boss and secretary, though that would continue, but as mother and son. Two people who'd been separated by circumstances beyond their control were now being given an unexpected chance to know each other, and Edward wanted to take that chance despite all the anger and hurt and complications. Patricia had agreed, though she'd been uncertain whether it could work, whether they could maintain separate personal and professional relationships, whether Edward would be able to see past his anger to build something positive. But they'd tried. Carefully and tentatively at first, meeting for dinner occasionally outside of work, sharing their histories, learning about each other. Edward telling Patricia about James and Helen Chen, the adoptive parents who'd given him every advantage but had also kept the truth of his origins from him. Patricia telling Edward about Sarah and Michael and Jennifer, his half-siblings, about Thomas who'd died the year before, about the life she'd built that from the outside had looked normal, but that had always been shadowed by grief for the son she'd lost. Over months and then years, Edward and Patricia built a relationship that was complicated and imperfect, but meaningful to both of them. They learned to separate their professional interactions from their personal ones, to be boss and secretary at work, while being something closer to mother and son outside the office. It wasn't a traditional relationship by any definition, but it was theirs, built from loss and regret and the desire to salvage something good from a situation that had begun with so much pain. They kept the relationship secret from everyone except Patricia's other children, who learned about their half-brother and welcomed him into the family with varying degrees of enthusiasm and adjustment. Sarah had been shocked, but ultimately accepting, pleased to have a successful older brother even if the circumstances of his existence were complicated. Michael had been more skeptical, wondering why Edward had manipulated the situation rather than approaching Patricia honestly, though he'd eventually warmed to his half-brother. Jennifer had been openly excited, always having wanted an older brother, treating Edward's appearance in their lives like a gift rather than a complication. But outside Patricia's immediate family, the secret was carefully maintained. At work, Patricia was Edward's secretary, nothing more, professional, proper, excellent at her job, but still just an employee. She attended company events standing on the sidelines, watching Edward be celebrated for his successes, never able to claim the pride she felt in his accomplishments. She worked late helping him prepare for crucial meetings, solved problems that kept the company running smoothly, contributed to decisions that shaped the company's direction, all while being seen as just a secretary rather than as someone with a deeper connection to the CEO. Edward watched his mother work tirelessly to support him professionally, seeing her dedication and excellence, but unable to publicly recognize that she was more than just an employee, that the woman scheduling his meetings and managing his correspondence was also the woman who'd given him life and had spent 40 years grieving for him. He couldn't celebrate holidays with her openly, couldn't acknowledge her at family events, couldn't be seen as her son in any public context. The cost of maintaining the secret was high for both of them, though they'd convinced themselves it was necessary. For 30 years, Patricia and Edward maintained this dual relationship, secretary and boss at work, mother and son in their private lives carefully hidden from public view. They had dinner together every month, celebrated Edward's birthday privately, talked on the phone every Sunday evening when Patricia would call his home number instead of his work line. Patricia met the women Edward dated, offered advice on his relationships, was the person he called when those relationships ended, and he needed comfort. Edward helped Patricia financially when her furnace broke or her car needed expensive repairs, sent her on vacations she couldn't have afforded on her secretary's salary, made sure his mother never had to worry about money, even though she didn't know he was supplementing her income through anonymous deposits. It worked, after a fashion, this strange arrangement they'd created, but the cost was high in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Patricia was professionally successful, respected by everyone at Chen Global for her competence and dedication, but she was also invisible in important ways. She was just a secretary, a position that was valued but not celebrated, essential but not honored. Her intelligence and contributions were acknowledged, but only within the narrow confines of her job description. She could never be recognized as Edward's mother, the woman who'd made enormous sacrifices to give him opportunities, the person who'd supported him not just for 3 decades in the workplace, but for his entire life in ways that went far beyond professional duties. Edward was professionally successful, built a billion-dollar company, became wealthy and influential and respected in his industry. But he couldn't publicly honor the woman who mattered most to him, couldn't acknowledge that his success was built not just on his own efforts but on the support of a mother who'd first given him up to give him a better life, and then come back into his life to support him however he'd allow. He attended his half-siblings, weddings and graduations and family events, but always as their half-brother, never as Patricia's son, maintaining a distance that felt increasingly wrong as the years passed, and Edward became more aware of how much the secrecy was costing all of them. As Edward moved through his 40s and into his 50s, he began to think more seriously about legacy and what really mattered. He thought about James and Helen Chen, the adoptive parents who'd given him everything but had also robbed him of the chance to know his biological mother earlier by keeping the truth from him. He thought about Patricia, working beside him every day, loyal and dedicated and excellent at her job, but never receiving recognition for who she really was and what she'd really sacrificed and how much she'd supported him throughout his entire life. He thought about the secrecy that had seemed necessary when he'd first revealed his identity to Patricia, but that now felt like a betrayal of the woman who deserved better. Edward made a decision. He was 52 years old, successful beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first started Chen Global Industries 3 decades earlier, but also aware that life was finite and opportunities to make things right were limited. He needed to honor Patricia publicly, needed to acknowledge who she was and what she'd done, needed to stop hiding their relationship as if there was something shameful about it. Patricia deserved better than secrecy. She deserved recognition not just as an excellent secretary, but as an extraordinary person who'd overcome tremendous adversity and who'd devoted her life to serving others, including him, with remarkable grace and strength. So Edward had called the meeting, gathered over 200 employees, executives, and board members, and made the decision to reveal the truth that he and Patricia had kept hidden for 30 years. Standing at that podium, looking at Patricia beside him with her silver hair and warm eyes and the gentle face that had greeted thousands of employees over 3 decades, Edward felt both terrified and liberated. Terrified of how people would react, how the revelation would change his and Patricia's lives, how it might affect the company and its reputation. But liberated by finally being able to tell the truth, to honor his mother publicly, to stop pretending that their relationship was only professional when it was so much more profound than that. The speech Edward gave that day, revealing Patricia as his biological mother and explaining the complicated history that had led to their 30-year secret, moved everyone in the room. People cried openly as Edward described Patricia's sacrifice at 16, his discovery of his adoption at 40, the manipulative way he'd brought her into his life, the relationship they'd built in secret, and his decision to finally honor her publicly by firing her as his secretary so he could recognize her as his mother. When Edward detailed the ways he planned to honor Patricia, appointing her to the board of directors, giving her significant equity in the company, establishing a $50 million foundation in her name to support single mothers and adoption services, the applause was genuine and emotional. This wasn't a scandal. This was a story of love and sacrifice and family, and everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something important and real. In the days and weeks that followed the revelation, Patricia's life changed in ways both wonderful and challenging. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a secretary, no longer hiding the most important relationship of her life. Employees approached her with new respect and warmth, treating her as Edward's mother rather than just his assistant. The press picked up the story, turning Edward and Patricia's reunion into a feel-good narrative about adoption and family secrets and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. The Patricia Williams Foundation began its work, helping other young single mothers have choices and support that Patricia hadn't had in 1973. But more important than any of the external changes was the internal shift for both Edward and Patricia. They could finally be mother and son publicly, without secrecy or shame. They could celebrate holidays together openly, attend family events without hiding their connection, acknowledge the relationship that had always been there but that had been forced underground by fear and social convention. Patricia could be proud of her son publicly, could claim her role in his success and acknowledge the pain of their separation and celebrate their reunion without worrying about professional consequences or social judgment. What did you think of Edward and Patricia's incredible journey? From teenage mother forced to give up her baby in 1973 to secretary and boss who were secretly mother and son for 30 years, to finally being able to celebrate their relationship publicly. Their story shows us that family comes in unexpected forms, that some secrets are kept out of love, not shame, and that it's never too late to honor the people who've meant the most to us. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. How would you have handled learning you were adopted at age 40? Do you think Edward was right to manipulate Patricia into working for him before revealing his identity? What would you have done in Patricia's position when you discovered your boss was your biological son? And do you think 30 years was too long to keep their relationship secret? Share your story. Your experience might help someone else who's dealing with adoption, family secrets, or complicated relationships that don't fit conventional categories. Now, rate this story from 0 to 10. Let me know what you thought. Was it the powerful journey of mother-son reconnection you were hoping for? And if you believe that family is more than biology, that love can heal even decades of separation, that sacrifice deserves to be honored, and that it's never too late to tell the truth and celebrate the people who've given us life and opportunity, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more incredible true stories coming your way every week. Thank you so much for watching Edward and Patricia's story. Remember, if you're struggling with decisions about adoption, family secrets, or relationships that don't fit conventional molds, you're not alone. Every family is unique. Every story of love and sacrifice deserves to be honored. The bonds between parents and children transcend circumstances and time. And it's never too late to acknowledge the truth, to end the secrecy, to celebrate the people who matter most, even if that truth has been hidden for decades. Until next time, this is Deep Stories, where every story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, that some secrets protect but eventually need to be revealed, that family is defined by love, not just biology, and that honoring those who have sacrificed for us is one of the most important things we can ever do. See you in the next one.